Have you give our final opening statement.
Thank you very much. I think I'm now owed about an hour. I think everybody's overrun.
At least.
I'd like to first of all say thank you to the Munk organizers for allowing me as an African to say a few words about the state of my continent, even though I'm not a celebrity. I just wanted to start off by saying, ladies and gentlemen, we are all on the same side. And what do I mean by that? There are three fundamental points that we all agree on, I believe. First of all, we all agree that Africa cannot rely on aid forever. We can sit here and quibble about whether it's 5 years or 10 years or 100 years, but I think we fundamentally agree that Africa cannot rely on aid forever. It is not the optimum solution. By the way, if anybody thinks Africa should rely on aid, please stop me. But I think we agree on that. The second thing we agree on is African governments must lead the charge to increasing growth and reducing poverty on the continent. It is not the responsibility of Westerners. It is not the responsibility of the celebrities. Yes, we do need the international community to be front and center alongside African governments, but ultimately the responsibility of leading the charge for Africa's future is the responsibility of the African governments. The third thing that I believe that we agree on is that aid has and continues to contribute to the dysfunctionality of African states. The point that Stephen mentioned earlier about corruption is not a figment of my imagination, nor is it something of the past, I'm afraid to say. Just a couple of months ago, the president of Malawi was indicted for stealing aid money. As I speak, the former president of my country, Zambia, is embroiled in a corruption scandal. So on the one hand, aid is contributing to the corruption, but even in the best case scenario, it is allowing African governments to abdicate their responsibilities of providing public goods. Governments around the world, like the Canadian government, the American government, British government, and governments all around the world are charged and elected to provide public goods. In Africa, however, public goods such as education, healthcare, infrastructure, and yes, even security are provided by donors. That is completely unacceptable. And I will point to a comment by a friend of mine from Africa who said, actually, why do we even bother going to stand in the hot sun to elect and vote for these leaders? We should actually be voting between CEDA and USAID because ultimately they're the ones who are providing us with the public goods. I want to remind everyone in this room why it is, or what the origins of aid are. If you go back to the 1966 literature by Chinnery and Strout, thank you very much, Paul Collier, for teaching me this. You will be familiar with the story that there was a very simple economics identity, that savings would lead to investment, which would lead to growth. In the absence of savings, however, and remember, if we're talking about the 1950s and 60s, there were newly founded countries coming out of the colonial period. There was not much savings in these economies. So the idea was actually a laudable one, and it was coming out of the Marshall Plan, the success of the Marshall Plan, which I'll come to later, but the simple idea was that aid would replace savings, and aid would therefore drive investment and ultimately lead to growth and reduce poverty. So those are the two metrics upon which we should be judging the aid model. The question then becomes, over the past 60 years, where over $1 trillion of aid money has gone from the Western world towards Africa, have we seen an increase in growth? The answer is no. Have we seen a decline in poverty? The answer is no. Paul Collier himself has talked about African continent shearing off, or the bottom billion shearing off from the rest of the world. So on those two metrics alone, the aid model has failed. How does aid contribute to less growth and higher poverty? Let me count the ways. Because of the time constraint, I actually had my top 10 reasons why aid doesn't work, but I'm just going to go through a whole handful of them very quickly. It fuels corruption, which is the most obvious one. And by the way, this is not my words. This is actually literature from the World Bank, from the IMF, from development institutions, and from academics about how and what aid does in these poor developing countries. Fuels corruption. encourages inflation. It leaves African countries and other developing countries with significant debt burdens that they cannot repay. It kills off the export sector. It induces civil unrest because, remember, the aid money is pooling at the top to governments. It kills entrepreneurship, and ultimately it disenfranchises the African citizens. Our governments spend their time courting and catering donors. They do not care about what we have to say. In other words, it's the reverse Boston Tea Party. No representation without taxation. Ultimately, we are trying to be like you. And you know that you do not rely on aid. You know that the government responds to you and provides you with public goods simply because they have to rely on the tax base which you provide. Proponents of aid will argue that there are 2 million Africans on HIV/AIDS drugs. 34 million Africans are going to school. So on and so forth. And that's great. And I myself sit on charity boards that look specifically at HIV drugs and at providing education. But they neglect 3 fundamental questions. First of all, what is going to happen in 10 to 20 years when actually these aid programs are not able to be financed? The fact that places like the United States are facing 10% unemployment rates and they have other pressing concerns, Germany is contracting by up to 6%, leads us as Africans to wonder what is going to happen. But never mind that. That's a minor problem. Second question, what are African governments doing with the money that they have? Paul Collier is right. We've just come out of one of the most amazing bull runs in commodity prices. Does anybody care to ask what has happened to that money? Oh no, let's just give them more aid. And finally, what exactly is the plan for African governments to deliver on their provision of public goods? Again, nobody wants to know that. The good news, ladies and gentlemen, is we actually know what delivers growth and what reduces poverty. In our lifetime, China has moved 300 million people out of poverty. Did they do this with aid? No. They did it with trade. They did it with foreign direct investment. They relied on the capital markets, which, by the way, I should point out that a Chinese diplomat said anybody who says to you, Dambisa, this was 2 months ago, that the capital markets are closed and that your argument that African governments should go to the capital markets is ludicrous is clearly a Westerner. Says, if you want to raise capital, come to China and come to the Middle East. We have the money. We are looking to create jobs. Enough with the handouts. We are trying to be equal partners on the global stage. We do not want sympathy. We do not want pity. We want opportunities. And the only ways we're going to get that if you stop feeling sorry for Africans and start treating us as equals and adults and not as children. I'm going to end up my last point. Last point is a comment that a friend of mine from Nigeria made. He said, why have you bothered to write this book? It's a complete waste of time. Nobody cares. And he said, the problem is, and he said, you do know why they give aid. Ultimately, it's because Africa is to development what Mars is to NASA. We spend billions of dollars every year analyzing, researching, quibbling about data, but ultimately nobody really knows, and nobody really believes that we're going to live on Mars, and nobody believes that Africa is actually going to develop.